Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm the community manager for the ICFJ's Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. Today, we are doing this at a very different time, and I think for many of our audience in different parts of the world that used to complain that they were unable to join us because of the time zone. I believe that this session is going to be exactly for you, and we're excited that we can be reaching you on this time zone today. And by extension, we also have a lot of audience that will be joining us, not just on Zoom, but those that will also be watching this live stream on different platforms, including various Facebook pages. And a few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, we started this conversation around podcasting. And if you've been following us closely enough, you would agree with me that podcasts they seem to have come to stay. And a lot of media organizations are already making this shift and mainstaying podcasts as an effective channel to actually reach their audience and attract new listeners. And the VOA is one of such. Previously, when we've had these conversations on podcasts, we've talked about it from the context of new ways for individual content creators to reach out. But today, we are looking at it from the perspective of a major media organization that continues to find new ways to engage new audience. So which is why we have a very rich panelist today, which I will start with Karina, who is a video journalist from Africa Division from the Voice of America. Karina, can you say hi to our audience? Oh, your mic is off. I love saying that on Zoom.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone.
Yes, thank you very much, Karina. Karina is a video journalist, and if you are watching a lot of podcasts these days, it's not just about audio again. You see elements of video, and so she'll be telling us how this is all coming together. Let me also introduce a digital producer and reporter with the VOA, Chetra Chap. How are you doing, Chetra?
Hi, Paul. Hi, everybody. My colleagues. It's nice to be here.
Yes, Chetra is also with the Voice of America. And the third person I would like to introduce is Steve Miller, who is a host and News Center Radio Managing Editor with the VOA. Steve, thank you for joining us today.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Paul, and hello to everyone else out there.
And last but not the least, this person is somebody I grew up listening to, radio. I remember then I would have the small radio and his voice usually booms out, welcome to the sunny side of sports. I was like, damn, this man's energy with sports is quite fictitious and addictive. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the host of Sunny Side of Sports in person of Mr. Sonny Young. Thank you, John, for joining us today, Sonny.
Sporty greetings, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me and my VOA colleagues.
Yes, thank you very much. So we'd like to start with, before I go with our questions, for all our audience that are joining us in different parts of the world, like we usually do, we'd like to know where you're joining us from. And if you would like us to, we would like you to be part of this conversation, which is really, really going to be as interactive as possible. Because for me, I actually have more than enough questions to go around everybody. And hopefully we can also take some audience questions. So if you would like to engage with us, if you like to get your messages across, please use the chat box to tell us where you are joining us from. And probably our guests and panelists will use that in probably addressing one or more issues. So we'd like to start with Sonny to give us a quick background. And the way I see this happening, probably you can loop this into your presentation, is to probably look at when you started practicing, when you started practicing as as a radio journalist. I still know nobody knew about podcasts before. We used to use batteries to put batteries on transistor radios, but now we can actually access archives of audio materials on our laptops. So how did this transition happen, and how did somebody like you that was used to the conventional ways of reaching audience adjusted to this new reality? Can you please loop this into whatever you have as your opening remarks?
Yes, thank you, Paul. In terms of VOA itself, the organization has evolved over the years. Originally, Voice of America started out strictly as radio only, founded during World War II in 1942. So we're celebrating our 80th year of broadcasting. And I'm just estimating now, I would say over the past 20 years or so, we've really boosted our programming in television, as well as digital, in terms of internet. Zoom is really something that, just a few years ago, I didn't even know about Zoom, was not aware of it. And, in some ways, Paul, it has really bridged cultures and countries and media organizations. Seeing you now in Nigeria is great, and in terms of VOA though, just to give you perspective, when I started, we had these things called wire machines. This is going way back, and you basically had to strip the wire copy off the machine and then read it or give it to an editor for a specific geographic region. Nowadays, of course, it's available. You can find stuff on the internet, in your own email, much more immediate. That's just one of the many ways broadcasting and VOA has changed. And the other quick point I'd like to make, Paul, is I hope you do get to visit our VOA headquarters someday in Washington. And when you walk into the main entrance, you'll see flags of all different countries represented at VOA. And there's last count, I think there's more than 40 different flags of various countries. We broadcast in more than 40 different languages. We've been described as a United Nations of broadcasting. And so my geography has improved, Paul, since I started working at VOA.
Wow, that's I expect that to actually be the case, because I remember when we began to open up, one of the first places that I visited for when the lockdowns ended, one of the first places that I visited to host a webinar, I think to close out last year's series of webinars, was the headquarters of the BBC office in London. And it was really, really amazing to see this collection of different journalists from different backgrounds. And I know something similar to, and something similarly huge to, will be happening at the VOA. So my question I would like to bring in Steve in, is, he's when you were doing as a journalist working in this space, how did you adjust? Or let me say, did you, because it doesn't seem to have ended. How do you adjust to additional responsibilities like, we now want to package what we are doing for podcasts. We have to send out newsletters. But focusing on podcasts, what additional responsibility, additional task, or additional duty, and how strenuous or how easy is it to actually add this to the large number of responsibilities you are always tasked with?
Well, again, this is my personal opinion, not necessarily those reflecting the agency, the government, or USAGM. Prior to coming to VOA, I was a freelancer in South Korea, and I only got into podcasting because people who were following my YouTube videos begged and pleaded for me to start a podcast. I didn't even know anything about it. And as I was launching the podcast, and this was way back, I think 2011, 2012 or so, I was really surprised. It didn't entail too much extra work. I mean, finding a host, finding a distribution method, getting it into, at that time, is really iTunes and Google. There are certainly a lot of different distribution and podcast directories now to get into. And there's a little bit of work, I would say, on the back end, the pre-launch side of things and getting things out there. But really, with any digital product you have, you're going to spend some time perfecting it, making sure it's what you want it to be, making sure that it's unique. And that's the same of any product you have, whether it be a YouTube video, a television show, a radio show. The work that goes into creating your end product is going to be the same. In terms of different things for podcasts, it's making sure that your distribution network, going out to the different podcast directories, are working, that they're updated regularly, and that you have a good social media strategy to make sure that when episodes drop, that they are publicized, because we are exposed to so much content these days. Sometimes it gets lost in the shuffle if it's just released out into the wild without any kind of buzz on the Facebooks or the Twitters, the TikToks, etc. So there's a little bit more work on that end. But I personally have found that in terms of publicizing, whether it be a radio show or a TV show I'm involved with, there's not a whole lot different in terms of what's involved in managing a podcast, aside from making sure that when you publish on your platform, whether it be your website or whatever, that RSS feed, the feed that the directories get to let the world know that a new episode is out there, that's working, it's unbroken. That's really the only thing I have found extra that's required to do.
Yeah, if I stay with you, your podcast, the Flashpoint Ukraine Daily, is something that is a daily audio podcast. And in the last session that we had on this subject of podcasts, one of the questions that arose was how frequent, or is it normal? Is it something you can, somebody that is producing a podcast, is it daily, is it weekly, is it monthly? And it wasn't a straightforward decision. So what led to the decision to make your particular podcast to be a daily one? And how do you pull it off to still ensure that it is fresh, it is relevant, and it is not just too much for your audience?
Oh, that's a great question. And to back up a little bit, how often should a podcast be? The answer is whatever it needs to be, whatever your goal is. And that's something that has to be decided on the onset. Is it going to be a monthly? Is it going to be a weekly? Is it going to be a daily? Those are things that have to be decided ahead of time, and really have the discussion as to how sustainable that is. Now, going back to Flashpoint Ukraine, the show I currently host on VOA right now, that was a decision because of the tension growing in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine back in late January, early February. We made a decision to launch a daily show. And the reason really was is that, as Sunny will tell you, I have a background in producing radio for VOA, and I was a host of a daily 30-minute global news show. So the workflow that went into creating that previous show was the kind of the workflow I put into launching and managing Flashpoint Ukraine. So it's really starting an 8-hour process early in the morning, looking what's going on, figuring out what's going to be in, scheduling guests, booking those guests, doing the interviews, finding the right stories, finding the people to interview around the world to help put context into that day's news, and then wrap it all up and get it into our distribution network by the deadline. And this is the one thing I can't hit home hard enough, at least in my opinion, is that when you have a podcast, whether or not it's a daily podcast or a monthly podcast, to build that audience, one of the things that I have found over really almost 10 years now of doing podcasts is that having that release schedule almost set in stone really helps build the audience. So whatever you decide, if you decide every day by 2:00 the podcast is going to be out, you really need to stick to that schedule. If it's going to be every month on the 3rd of the month by 5 p.m., do it that way. When I was in South Korea working as a freelancer, I had a morning news podcast, and the goal I had was Monday through Friday before 8 a.m. Sometimes it was out at 7 a.m., sometimes it was out at 7:30. But my commitment to my listeners was by 8 a.m. And that really helped me grow the audience because my desire was to have it ready by their morning commute. So having that in mind really helps you build your workflow around it. Sometimes you got to start early. And if you're going to have a later show, you can start later in the afternoon. But whatever you feel is manageable in terms of a release time, kind of, you work backwards to figure out what's the best strategy to get you there in the end.
Wow, thank you for that. And I think I would like to bring in Chetra in this context, because we seem to be seeing this trend of people. Probably podcasts may be much popular among a particular region of the world. And but your service, the VOA Commerce service, I think is really good for you to let our audience know what this geographical region. I think it's just said on the VOA's Cambodia service, if I'm absolutely right. So we always see, because in the African context, unlike people that have been on these things for 10 years, it's probably something, podcasting is something that only went mainstream recently. So what has been your experience over there? And do you still see that your audience is large enough in that particular language that are also interested, that would prefer podcasting? And how do you see this shift? Do you see a shift to podcasting happening, or podcasting being a means for you to attract audience into the mainstream VOA, Cambodia, or Puma service in general? So what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Sonia, too, for sharing all those experience, very valuable. And definitely, yes, what we did was what we call a limited series podcast. So instead of daily, monthly, or regularly, due to resource, we are a small team, the Cambodian service, VOA. So we decided to do it in like 7 episodes per season. So we created a theme called Bayon Bayou. Bayon is like the name of a temple in Cambodia, and Bayou is the border at the southern part of the United States. So it's like the Cambodian American experience. So what we did, we create this theme of the Cambodian American experience, Cambodian coming to the state, living in America, and dealing with all the issues. And then we create season 1, season 2, season 3. But season 1, we already published 7 episodes. We focus on anti-Asian hate at that time, COVID-19, and being Cambodian in that. And then we have people from different field, medical, from media, from activism, to talk about their life. So that way is we think this is the best way to start getting into podcasts. This is our first English podcast. So it's easy, like 7 episodes. You can plan it out, selecting guests, and start doing it. And you mentioned the Cambodian market. Podcast is very new in Cambodian market. People don't even use the word, we don't use the podcast app, either Apple, Google, or Spotify. We went in knowing that, but we believe that this format is very rich, because like now, we can call this a podcast. We are talking, and it's conversational. It's sharing personal experience, and basically a group of people talking about a topic they're interested in and care about. And I always look at it as like when I was young, after dinner, my father, mom, my family talk about politics or what happened. And as a kid, you just sit behind the scene and just listen. I feel like listening to podcasts is like that. So I believe it's a growing trend. So that's why, when we do our podcast, and we think about how do we approach the audience if we don't use the podcast app. We do put it on the podcast platform too, Apple and Google, but then we have to create another version of that episode in video format to put it on social media. So for example, if I go to YouTube, our YouTube channel here, we have every episode turned into a video.
So I was,
So the full episodes
I say
and
that
all
I
that.
would,
So people can listen because they are on YouTube and Facebook basically in Cambodia. So they can find us here and then they start to learn about podcasts, how to use podcasts. And then the fact that they don't use the podcast app doesn't mean that they don't know how to use the app. It's just that there's not enough producer of podcast content in Cambodia. So there's no point for the people to go there and use it. So that's our way to actually reach the audience, which is to turn it into a video and post it in social media as well.
Okay. Yeah. I think. Yeah. Okay. We'll get to the question later. Okay. Now I want to bring in Karina right, and I think I was really happy that we have a video expert on the panel, and because many of the productions that we are seeing, people just sit down, like he rightly said, it's more like a conversation. But I feel like when you are watching only the same shots, only the same frame shots of people, for me, it gets boring. You just see them with that weird mic. Everybody will have that mic and come back and they are talking. Do you think, what do you think video brings on for podcasts? And how do you think a producer or somebody that is doing that can creatively stand out with the quality of the production that goes in it without actually losing, spending a lot of resources and wasting a lot of time trying to get it right?
Yeah, so I think when you have a video podcast, the best thing is you're now reaching a wider audience, right? So you're now reaching people on social media, on the web, and it's not just radio or not just audio. So I think what's great is if it's visual, you obviously want to make it as visually as interesting as possible. So like you're saying, when you have only one camera and you just see people just sitting there and it's, the whole time, all you see is two people or, one person talking, that's kind of a standard. You want that shot where you do have, you see everybody that's in the podcast and you get to see them and you get to see them speak. But yeah, it's nice when you have multiple cameras, you can cut between when someone is talking, you can do a cutaway, you can do fun edits. Then I think it really matters, what's the theme of your podcast? Is it serious? Is it something that's fun? With us, we did the Basketball Africa League, which is it's a sports show. So we could do a lot of fun cuts, fun edits. I actually wanted to just show you an example before I really get into it.
I was about to say, lead us.
Let's see it, and then I can kind of talk about the shots we use, the graphics we used. So Chatra, if you can just play it.
Sporty greetings to all our Basketball Africa League fans. Good to have you here,
Good to have you, man. Welcome back.
I'm VOA's Sonny Young, coming to you from Kigali, Rwanda.
For the teams, when you know you're playing across Africa, but there's a bigger target, which is the BAL finals.
They were really looking forward to get to the finals again and say, this time around, we are not to do any mistakes.
Every opponent presents his own challenge, and that's a good team. We're a good team, and I guess we'll see what happens when we play each other.
And the best runner on the court can do up and down in
right.
8 seconds.
I remember reading some quotes from Akeem Olajuwon, and he said he had some of his best performances during Ramadan, hitting nothing but net.
The net.
See you next week.
Yeah, so that's just a short clip of kind of how, what our studio looked like and the elements we use. So I think what's important is when you have video and, you have access to material, what's nice is to show people, what you're talking about. So it doesn't get boring. So we're not just talking, if you're referencing a player or if we're referencing a time from the game, it's nice to show those visual elements. It's just more captivating that way. And I think the audience just engages more when they can see more as well. It's not just one person talking. So I think those are the elements we use. And also we created an intro for the podcast. And I think it's kind of important to have that, like a music that goes with your podcast that people will pick up on. You know, it's a kind of a audio cue as well as a visual cue that this is about to start and what the show is. So it's nice to create an intro. We would have Sunny and, you know, one of the hosts. We'll do some fun cuts, just some laughs, just to give you a feel of what the show is going to be about. And you can play with colors and things like that just to make it more interesting. So I think that's what's important. If you have only one camera, you know, to go with the one camera, that's okay. But if you have access to more, it's always better.
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed what you showed. The message I can take from there is it's not just about showing videos. The video needs to add something to the user. It's not just about you just showing us you and your friends just talking. It's boring. I've never been able to finish a video podcast that only has that format. And unfortunately, that seems to be the only format that is available out there, unlike what you did right here, in which we have a picture of the person you are talking to. And it began to bring to my mind previous experience of radio, just listening to the radio. There are some things that you would have loved to, you start imagining what the person interviewing the guest could look like, or what the guest would look like, probably additional things that are missing. So which simply means a video needs to be able to add something, not just because you have a video just as showing yourself. You have to be able to creatively and effectively deploy it. And if I can quickly ask, how long does it take to put all of that together? Is it something that is realistic when it's not just a full-blown media organization like the VOA that is behind this? What tips can you give to somebody that is just starting the podcast journey and would like to actually get the multimedia version really well? Karina?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that pre-planning is very important. So once you have an idea of how you want this video podcast to look, it's good to kind of create a template. So for us, you know, the first episode is probably what took us the longest to in post-production for editing. But once we had a sort of format for the intro, you know, we were just dropping clips and matching the rhythm of the music. And then once we had a graphic that we built for how we want, you know, the picture of the guests to show up and then have a, you know, name and title, those were also like templates that we created. So that's something that's important. I think pre-production, if you create those things, those elements, it's obviously going to make your editing process much easier as you start. Yes, it is extra work. You know, when it's the audio, you know, you probably just clean up the audio. You're not worrying about the visuals. But yes, if you have multiple cameras, you're cutting between cameras, you're adding visual elements, that is time consuming. But I would always recommend just build that template, build that idea of how you want things to look. And it's just an easier way to approach it if you're doing a weekly, daily. Also, another thing I would mention is, you know, if you are having multiple cameras, just make sure you know your shots, what shots you want. You know, there's always a static shot, and your cutaways, you know, is that something you want it to be a static multiple cameras, or do you want to do handheld? I did a lot of handheld stuff. I like that look. That's something, you know, I like that movement. That's another thing. If you don't want it to be too static, you know, add that movement. Make it clean, don't make it shaky, but just add that movement. It just makes it more exciting. Yeah, so of course, anytime you do any video work, pre-planning is big. Just make sure you know what you want and how you want things to look.
Yeah, then what about, I think it's really, really important to throw this open now about how the VOA is huge, it has its audience already. But how is this catching up in the entire ecosystem? And do you see it as just one-off thing, or do you think podcasts are here to stay? Anybody can take that.
Well, for me, I think podcasts are here to stay, for sure. People are going to get more creative with it. You know, visually creative. People are just going to take it in many directions, but I think it's definitely here to stay.
And I
What
would
do you think?
add, and I would
Yes.
also add, it's not just about, here to stay. As our lives continue to get busier, having media that we can consume on demand at our leisure, that we can push, pause. I mean, if you think about the explosion of streaming services for movies and television, you can watch a show, push pause, come back to it 3 days later, finish it off that way. With podcasts, it's the same thing. You can start a program in the morning, you go to work, you go to school, and you can finish it later on in the day. It's an incredibly useful and powerful medium that allows you to listen on demand rather than on a set schedule. And as we move forward in this technology, not only in terms of distributing across social media, but digitally, the media landscape as well, it allows us so much more in terms of what we have access to and when we have access to it, because we're in control of that.
I also want to add that not only it's on demand, easy to find, easy to stop and continue, it's also something you do on the background while you are doing something else, say driving or house chore or other things. And it's almost like your best friend. And it's talking about things that you are actually interested in. It's not just like you open the TV and looking for news and watch it. You are seeking that topic, you're seeking that issue. And I think the podcast format, especially in audio form, is here to stay. It is very powerful because it is the best way to dive deep into any topic. When after you listen to an episode of podcast, you kind of learn something rather than watching 100 reel on your phone and you feel like, oh my God, I just waste 3 hours and learn nothing. And that's why people are craving for this stimulation, like the intellectual stimulation after listening to a podcast. And also the audio format, it is spoken word. It's similar to reading a book, a good book. It's similar to watching a great movie, but the least amount of effort. Like if you watch a movie, you have to sit there and watch it until it ends. You read a book, it takes weeks or a month. But podcasts, you just listen and do something else, and you learn something. So that's very, very powerful. That's why people love it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. I remember my first set of podcasts that I was listening to, not on before everybody started doing podcasts now. In those days when you had to subscribe, I think iTunes, yes, when iTunes, you have to subscribe. I think the big media organizations are always usually the first set of organizations to catch on these new techies. I just remember the CNN, BBC, VOA2 used to have a podcast on those services that you actually subscribe to. But looking at the onslaught of podcasts now, every media organization has a podcast, every program has a podcast, and it's still the same audience, not because you are trying to address different audiences. It's still people you are aware of that are trying to address too. How do you think for instance, you work with media organizations, and probably this is also relevant to individuals that are doing podcasts too. What we used to describe as potential winning strategies for a podcast that will still be able to stand out, attract audience in spite of numerous podcasts around? This is an open discussion. Anybody can take that.
Well, I mean, one of the things I would say, and this goes back into some of the pre-planning, right? I talked about during the discussion of when to release podcasts, one of the things I mentioned was, what's sustainable? And, going back what Chetra said, if you're just first starting out, consider doing seasons. I mean, this is something that I did when I first started doing my podcast way back in 2010, 2011, 2012, is I would just do seasons. But I think fundamentally, there are a few questions you have to answer in terms of setting yourself apart and setting your podcast product apart. Really define what you're trying to do in terms of what product you're trying to create and what you're trying to reach. If there are other topics that are being covered in podcasts, what are they doing? How are they covering the topic? And really, how do you want to set yourself apart to create that niche, that something different, that value add that allows you to shine, when you create your product? And I guess one of the things I have told this of user generated content producers over the years is when your product is done, would you go back and listen to it? Would you enjoy it as much as you hope your listeners would? Because if you don't enjoy it, that's going to come through when you produce the show. And it's going to translate to probably a smaller audience than you would like. So whatever you create, really be behind it, really be invested in it, really enjoy it, because that's going to shine through the microphone, the camera, et cetera, and help you build that audience.
Paul, one quick point, it kind of follows up on what Steve and Chetra said. The Basketball Africa League podcast that Karina showed a clip of, that was pretty much seasonal. It was based on the league schedule of games, and they were intermittent. They tended to follow a 2-week schedule, and then there would be a break, and then there would be 2 more weeks of games. So we kind of fit the podcast around the Basketball Africa League schedule. And in terms of frequency, it was basically, it came about based on what we were told by the Basketball Africa League. We entered a contract with the Basketball Africa League, which is affiliated with the NBA, and they requested that we do a once-a-week podcast, 30 minutes in length. That was pretty much hard and fast. And I've heard it said on this forum, I think a podcast could be 5 minutes in length and be very effective. It could be 10 minutes in length and be very effective. I like the episode concept that Chetra was talking about, 7 episodes per season. So yeah, there's different ways to approach it. And but we were we had sort of instructions to follow in terms of our podcast.
I think we have a Prosper on the line who would like to ask question. Prosper, you can unmute your mic now. I've activated your mic, but I can see you've typed your questions already. Do you still want to ask your question live? Can you unmute Prosper? We also have Khan raising his hand. Khan and Prosper, you can talk. You have the floor. Okay, Prosper, you can go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, I have raised my hand by mistake. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Okay, no problem. Let me read your question. The question we have is, okay, you're just announcing. What about Khan? Do you want to talk? Wow. Lots of people are raising their hand. Samuel, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, just a second. Am I on now?
Yes, you are on, Samuel.
Oh, great. So I actually typed my question earlier, but I'll just speak it out. So my concern is about staying consistent and avoiding burnout. So I want to know the kind of systems the guys at VOA use to stay fresh and productive, producing consistently, without getting burnt out.
Over to you. Who wants to take that question?
I don't know how Steve do it every day. we only do 7 episodes and then we just done. And we produce everything, and then we have a schedule of publishing and distribution like once a week after. So I'll let Steve answer that because he's doing it every day.
What I say is I love doing it. I love the rush I get in following a topic intensely and putting together a good show. And, one of the things that makes it easier is that, while I am in charge of the daily production and hosting the show, there is a huge team behind me that helps every step of the way in finding guests, doing interviews, bringing together different stories that allows me not to be completely overwhelmed. And, we also have other backup hosts that can fill in for me so that I can take a day off and not have to do it on an everyday basis. So, moving forward with whatever release schedule you have, those are all things to keep in mind. When I was doing my very first podcast, a decade ago, right? I mentioned that it was a seasonal type thing. I was a university professor, and I was doing it while I was also teaching. So it was once a week. It was easy for me to manage. It wasn't overwhelming. Like Karina said, I had a template, and that was the format of the show every single week. So I knew what I could pop in there every single week to get the episode out. And when it was time for me to go on winter holiday or summer vacation, I stopped the podcast and allowed me to recharge. And I found that when the semester started up again, I was raring to go because it was something I absolutely love. But, Sonny also puts together a show every single day. So Sonny, what do you have to say?
No, I would agree with Steve. I mean, I have an interest in sports, and I actually have an interest in audio production too, since largely because of the pandemic. I've done more audio production over the past couple of years, and I've gotten better at it. And I look forward to, like Steve, putting together the show. That said, I perhaps need more breaks than Steve does at this stage of my career. And working with people like Karina does make it a lot easier. Because I certainly could not do any of that video production on my end. That's not part of my skill set, shall I say.
We have Bimisola on the line too. Bimisola would like to ask questions. Bimisola, you have the floor.
Okay. Good afternoon or evening or whatever time it is over there. I have a question. Were you doing the podcast for fun? I mean, as in, were you monetizing the podcast, or you're just doing it because you liked it, or was your passion, or how were you getting paid to do the podcast?
Yeah, let me probably frame that question. Is VOA making money off those podcasts? Don't freeze on me. Somebody has to answer that
Steve,
question.
do you want to answer that, Steve?
No, go ahead, Sonny.
No, I mean, we're a non-commercial entity. So as far as I know, we're not making money off the podcasts, but I could be wrong. I mean, I know YouTube is driven by advertising.
But we don't have ads in our YouTube videos.
Yeah.
As far as I know, and to back something up, these are our products because we aren't a commercial entity. So they aren't commercially driven. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, okay, yes. I think Khan, we still have Khan on the line. Khan, do you still want to ask question? I don't think so. Now, so let's talk about the trends now. Let's talk about the trends, and most everybody have a podcast. Who will you recommend a podcast for, or who do you think, nah, this is not for you? Let's start with Karina. Karina has been very quiet. Your mic is off.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, who do you think a podcast is for? Then if I can really localize it to you, what kinds of podcasts need videos, and who do you think shouldn't even worry about starting a video podcast?
I think podcasts is of course for everyone, because now what you're seeing with podcasts is that it's a wide range of topics, right? It's entertainment, it's news, it's storytelling, it's everything. So I think podcasts can be for all ages. As far as the video side of it, of course, you can make any podcast the video element, like you put your camera, you shoot yourself talking. And I guess what you were saying also is that sometimes it's not as entertaining to watch one person talking. So I think when it comes to the visual element of a podcast, really, if you have enough content to show, I think that's better. Of course, if it's, if you have the visual material, like if you're telling, I don't know, if you're doing like a news podcast and you have material to show and the references of the topics you're talking about, then yeah, please, I think you should go for the video podcast, because you will reach more people that way. But if it is something where you're, even if it's something you're talking about your personal life, or you're the podcast for giving advice for things, maybe in those cases you don't have visual material. But if it's an engaging conversation, I think people will tune in, people will watch. 2 people talking, 3 people, 4 people talking. If it's the beauty of podcasts is it's conversational. So you have a back and forth, you have people, they smile, they interject others, and they come in for conversation. So it's not so, one question, one answer, and then another person asks a question, and another person answers. It's such a shared conversation. So I think a lot of times that's entertaining. I like watching podcasts, even if it's just people speaking, if the conversation is good. So I think that's something, even if it's just audio or if it's just video, just people talking, just make sure it's entertaining, it's valuable conversation, and it's engaging, really.
Yeah, Sonny, what can you say about this? Who you still recommend a podcast for, and who will you discourage from starting a podcast?
Paul, I actually learned quite a bit during those Basketball Africa League podcasts that we did. Karina, she was there for just about all of them, but it offered discussion among the co-hosts about, should we have just one guest for 30 minutes? Should we have multiple guests? Because there were some that I thought really dragged in terms of the information that was coming out. You're well aware, Paul, that somebody's voice can, I hate to say it, put you to sleep if they're not captivating. And so I think what we had to do was try to decide. Do we want one guest for 30 minutes? Do we want 2 guests? Do we want to do conversation between the co-hosts at the start of the podcast and then maybe go to the guest, which we did some of that. So what I'm saying is we experimented during the course of the podcasts. I think we did have a template in place, but the template kind of shifted a little bit over the course of the podcasts. And so, yeah, I learned a lot. And I think I would say I'm in favor of shorter podcasts. I mean, I know we have a lot of, different options today in terms of podcasts. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think I'm going to continue to learn if we go through with these next year also.
Steve, what do you want to add?
I'm sorry. What was that, Paul?
Do you have anything to add to this?
The one thing I would add is that, what we view as podcasts today may not be what podcasts are in the future. If you look to where they were, 10 years ago, it was strictly audio, strictly something you downloaded. Today, as Karina pointed out, there's a wide variety of video podcasts. So who knows what the next iteration will be when the technology evolves. And there's such a wide variety of content that you can make serialized or on a release schedule that people are going to find interesting. So I say for the future, who knows what's going to come.
Yeah, talking of future, we have this question from a participant. The question reads thus: what was our host expectations with their first podcast production? Was it easy to find a specific subject regarding experience? How do they see the future of podcasting in coming years? I think Steve started from the last point. Who also wants to take on any aspect of this question? Chepa, you've been quiet.
Yeah, I mean, expectation. Well, I think it go back to the previous question too. You know, some of the biggest podcasts in the world right now are just two people talking, you know, just conversation. So the key is, what is the whole expectation, or the thing that the host should think about when you start a podcast is basically, I'm sure anyone will find something they care the most about. So if you find an issue that you're really passionate about, do on that. And then what we learned from doing our own podcast, which is the Cambodian American experience, our host, she is also Cambodian American. So she shared that experience. And the key thing is to do a non-boring static conversation, like Karina mentioned, is like if the conversation is engaging, then people want to listen to it. And that's what we did. Mandy, our host, what she did was she actually contacted and talked with the guest like for 1 or 2 hours a week before recording. And to do that, they create this bond between the guests, build trust and share their own experience. And that lead to engaging conversation. And I think people, they like to hear opinions in a podcast, but also they also prefer hearing or seeing the process of the guest getting to that opinion. So it's very heavy burden on the host to be able to create the experience for listener, to show the guest thinking process, the thought process and all that. And that's the best way to engage an audience. And I see video, I mean, the video podcast these days, they record 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, and then they talk about 10 subject in there. And then they cut into small clip, 10 clip, and then they post it on separately as a focus on the point, and got a lot of views. And I think they make a lot of money too for those people. And if you think about it, just talk a conversation for 1 hour and then cut the clip and post it. And if the conversation is engaging and interesting, yeah, people watch it.
Yeah. Any additional thoughts regarding the future of podcasts? Sonny and Karina.
Well, Paul, I was going to maybe throw this to Karina. There's a question from Chris. I hope I pronounced your name right, Chris. Chris Deschard in the chat section. Karina, can you comment on the value of long form news storytelling? Long form news storytelling.
Yeah, so I actually really love long form news storytelling because I think you can really dive deep into a lot of subjects, right? The importance is you have short news, and I've worked in live news, 30-minute live news programs where you just have to give the main points of the story just to kind of inform people what's happening. But then you do long form like documentaries, and you have scope to speak to so many people. You have scope to look at a story from so many different angles. You really get a sense of what people are feeling, what people are saying, and I think that's so valuable, right? Because when you have that opportunity to create documentaries, it's important to really get to feel your subjects, get to feel a story of what's happening. So I think people should really get into long form storytelling for sure, and something that I really value myself.
And one really quick note, sorry, Paul, to interject there. And I think that really goes back to like the whole purpose of VOA is Sonny and I talked about, VOA being a non-commercial entity. The purpose of VOA is to really provide journalism and content that's of public interest to the world. And that's really what drives us. So if you look at some of the documentary and long form programs that VOA is putting out now, especially in terms of coverage of refugee stories, it really allows the stories to really unfold, whether they be a video product or even as an audio product. Because in some of my past shows, I've taken some of the elements from the video documentary of lives of refugees and built an audio product around that to really create the theater of the ear for my listeners, so they can also experience that kind of storytelling.
Yeah,
And
we
Steve,
have.
sorry, I was
No,
just
go-
going to go off of what Steve was saying. I think even with audio, when you do long form audio storytelling, like you're saying, like if you can pick up on those sounds, like if you're out somewhere and you grab that sound, you really put people in those places. So that's how you make audio storytelling engaging as well, right? It doesn't just have to be people talking, but just the sound, like fade in sounds, fade it out, and really take people to places. Even without visuals, just take people to the locations you're in, so people really understand.
I just say for 30 seconds, when you think about long form storytelling, the highest form of long form is a movie, either a documentary or a narrative movie. And if you think about it, this is the most impactful and powerful way to influence society. Look at our life. We live based on quotes and soundbite from movies. All those culture, long form storytelling actually create culture.
Yeah, so we have this, I think it's an important question on what topics do you think can be best produced through podcasts based your experience? I mean, the topics that match more with podcasts. Who wants to take this?
I feel like I'm manipulating, the microphone. In my past experiences, I really haven't found any topics that don't match with either a video podcast or an audio podcast. I think the trick is to find out the best way to tell that story, to discuss that topic in a way that's true to you as the host. And I think that may be the bigger challenge.
I think it's not the same as a news interview. I think it's more authentically the host, like what do you believe in, what you care about, and then you talk to people with a similar interest and you dig, you be curious, you listen, and you, just geek out about that topic, basically. One of the first topic that I really listened to was about technology. So I love gadget. I was a geek. So basically geeking about that topic. So that's, to me, podcast. Yeah.
Well, getting back, in terms of interest, Paul, the co-hosts with me on that Basketball Africa League podcast, they all, I would say they all love basketball. I mean, it wasn't like, pardon the pun, Chetra, but we weren't bringing in a tech geek to talk Basketball Africa League. It was people with a passion for the subject. In fact, one of the guys who co-hosted one of the shows, I believe he works for Bombora Service at VOA, former professional basketball player, Czech Tiero, big guy. He's like 6 feet 9 inches tall. And he loved to talk hoops. And, the guy had he has, I should say, an encyclopedic mind about some of these African players and their backgrounds and where they went to school. And so to bring somebody in like that for a podcast was invaluable. He, in many cases, he had, played against some of the players we were talking about. So, yeah, I think having a passion for the subject really counts for a lot.
Karina, do you want to be part of this round too?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, definitely you have to be passionate about the subject you're talking about. The conversation, if the conversation just ends for you right after the podcast ends and after you stop recording, maybe that's not the most interesting podcast, but maybe it's something you're passionate about and you can talk about it even when the camera's off, even when the audio's off and everything, recording is off, but you continue that conversation. And I think with the Basketball Africa League, once we would stop recording, the hosts would continue that conversation on their own. They had more to say. So I think they were really passionate about it, and that's key. That's key to any podcast.
Yeah, I think the last question, hopefully Yeah, let me look away from these questions. The last question I have is what metrics are you always looking at to determine whether a podcast is successful or not? So in terms of assessment, in-house QA, in-house metrics. So what are you always looking at for to track the success or non-success of a podcast? Steve, start this round as usual.
Oh, sure. I think there's lots of different ways to do it. I mean, going back to when I was first starting out, a decade ago, I was doing it for my own enjoyment and, to develop those skills. And the metric that I had was to develop the work ethic to really get the product out there. And then I set a goal of, well, I want to have so many downloads per month, or I want to have so many engagements, retweets or likes on Facebook or whatever. And that's kind of how I measured it. Different metrics come in terms of, am I growing my podcast regularly? Is it plateauing? Or if the downloads are going down, do I need to make a change, or is it time to switch topics? I think fundamentally you have to decide what you feel is a measure of success and build off that. Working on a show that is news driven, I always want to make sure that I provide the greatest amount of content, the most timely amount of content in the most unique way that listeners can find value in. Recently got a message from someone in Cuba who appreciated the show because all they had been previously exposed to was Russian propaganda. So they were able to get a complete picture because of the way we provide coverage of the war in Ukraine. And for me, that's a huge, huge metric in terms of the impact the show is having around the world.
Sonny, what are your metrics?
Well, Paul, I got to tell you, the biggest metric for me, you mentioned it right at the top. If somebody tells me that they heard me, or you said you listened to me when you were a lot younger, for me that's invaluable feedback. And I've had a few, people email me over the years that said including I've made a couple trips, not a lot of trips to Nigeria, but I was sort of floored. I had one young Nigerian man come up to me and he told me that he grew up listening to my voice on the radio, which for me was probably the best possible metric that I could ever get. But in terms of the podcasts, Karina worked on the video, so we were monitoring YouTube views, also Facebook. We tended to put the video podcasts on our social media pages. But as a radio guy, Paul, the listener metric is still pretty big for me.
Okay, and we have Christy. Can you still get on that? So that is you are going to wrap it up with a special question that is just for you. Karina?
Yes, sorry. What's the question?
We're talking about the metrics.
Oh, yes. So what I would say with metrics, I think what I see as one of the most important things is it getting a conversation going? I think that's a good way to say, a good way to see if the podcast is doing well. Like everything you're saying, are people on, through messages and through comments, are they now participating in this conversation? Are they talking to each other about the topics that you're bringing up? I think that's of course is one of the best ways to see how well your podcast is doing. You do want a conversation to keep going,
Yeah, and I promise this is the very, very last question, the very last question, and especially for you, how important is visual storytelling? I think you did a lot, some introduction of it, but I think it's really good to close it up. How important is visual storytelling in podcasting and techniques to enhance podcasts with visual elements? Karina?
Yeah, so for techniques, I think when we showed the video, there's a few things that you can see in the video that we, for what we did for Basketball Africa League, creating a sort of a little graphics for the people that you have that are calling in. So your guests who are on the phone, we're not seeing them. So it's nice to see an image of them, put a picture and of course, have a title and a name on that graphic. At the same time, what we also did was we had the picture and then we would have another box next to it to get the reaction of the hosts, which is nice. So now you're hearing what someone is saying, but then you also see how the hosts are reacting to it. That's a nice little element. If you can do that, it doesn't have to be like a fancy graphic. You can be as fancy as you want. You can keep it as simple as you want. But that's a nice way. So the audience knows who's talking and we can see. So we're not imagining what the person might look like. We can see who the person is. Some of the challenges we had when we were doing the podcast is, we're talking to people overseas. So sometimes the audio quality could be, it could be good, it could be bad, could be a lot of background noises. So in those cases, it's nice to have visual elements so people are not getting too distracted by the audio going in and out or anything like that. So you have something, you have reactions. I like seeing reactions. So for visual elements, do little cutaways of people when they're reacting. If someone is laughing, in your podcast, do a little cutaway of that. Do a, fun little cut. It doesn't have to be very traditional. I think you can experiment with your editing skills there too. Do fun cuts to this stuff, to the conversations. And another element is, have an intro. That's something I mentioned before too, like have an intro for your podcast. Build a little graphics for your podcast. So people, when they see it, even if you don't, sometimes, what a lot of people do is even if you don't have a video, but they'll put up like a graphic on screen as, that could go on YouTube, but it's just a graphics. And then, you have little, maybe a picture on there or something. And that's something you can use on YouTube while you just hear the audio. But it's important to just have something that people can see. If it's just audio and there's no video element you're using, you can put up a graphic. What other visual elements? Of course, if you have access to B-roll material, use it. If you are referencing to if it's your life that you're saying and something about your family, show some pictures of your family. Show things if you have access to it, of course. Show things that you're talking about. I think that's fun. And experiment, really. I think with podcasts, you have the ability to just kind of experiment with your editing skills, really. I think have fun with it.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'll now go run with our guest last remarks. So I'll start with Chetra. Any take-home point? What do you think is really most important for our guest participants today to go with? Your mic is off.
I think it's also go back to the question of metric too. So one of the most important things for me personally, I think, when you are a podcast host or podcast producer, your role is to serve the guests, to get their message across, to help them explain their points. So if I feel I do my job, if the guests tell me that, oh, I'm glad that we get to talk about all these things, I think that is the best metric for me. And I think that should be the role of any podcaster, which is to facilitate the guest, the speaker, to express everything they need to say, basically.
Yeah. Steve, what should be your take-home message?
I think it goes back to, finding your passion for wanting to do this, whether it's a straight news show, whether it's a long form show. But like I said, one of the fundamental questions I always ask myself whether it's producing a radio show, whether it's producing a video, whether it's producing a podcast, is after I spent all this time working on it and produced it and published it, would I go back and listen to it? And if the answer is yes, and when I listen to it, I enjoy it, then I feel good about what I did and I'm ready and energized to move forward. So as people think about doing podcasts moving forward, is really, spend some time and really find what you like. I once heard in a business class I took many, many years ago, when you start out doing your own business, you attract two kinds of people, they always said, people who are like you or people who want to be like you. So may not directly translate to building a podcast audience, but if you're energized and have a love for the product that you create, then chances are you're going to have an audience that does the same, and you go from there.
Let's go to Sonny.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I'll just quote Karina as my parting remarks. Have fun with it. Whatever type of podcast you choose to do, have fun with it. Experiment if you have the time to experiment, and maybe be flexible. The podcast might go in a direction that you didn't initially think it was going, and it might turn out better that way. So, but it's been thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, Paul. I really appreciate the international forum here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Karina, do you also want to say anything before we close this show?
Yeah, no, I would say really with podcasts, just pick something you're really passionate about, something you want to have a conversation with, even outside of doing this podcast, something you talk about, something you enjoy. And again, have fun with it, experiment visually, even audio wise, just, have fun really.
Yeah, so thank you very much. The message is loud and clear. Have fun, experiment, and tweak things around. Don't be afraid to try your hands on new things. And I really, really want to appreciate you for helping us to now balance out our two-part sessions on podcasting. It has been eye-opening and it has been tremendously useful, the tips and insights that you've shared today. And it has really been, for me personally, it has answered a lot of questions that I think our forum members that are still just starting this podcast journey are really going to have to deal with. I remember the last session when we did this two-part series on media entrepreneurship, and we asked our forum members to submit their ideas, and some of them actually submitted podcast projects, some of which, thanks to the insights that they got from our webinars, they've also been able to apply this. And I also hope that they attended this session or they watch this video so that they can further improve on their knowledge skills. So I want to say a big thank you to our panelists. You've been tremendous. I also want to say a quick shout out to Jim from VOA, who has been critical and useful in helping us to access experts from the VOA's vast collection of professionals spread across the world. So thank you very much. This is not going to be our last partnership. I always enjoy having the VOA team on board. And if you want to know more about this initiative, you want to know more about the International Center for Journalists, ICFJ Forum on Global Crisis Reporting, please check out ICFJ's website on www.icfj.org. And I also want to encourage you, if you are not yet part of our Facebook forum, that is what you are looking at on my screen, Facebook forum, just go through the, is on Facebook, and I think Trustella is putting the link to the direct link to the Facebook forum in the chat box right now. Yes, thank you very much. So just click that link. It's going to pop up here, and I'm going to accept you to join the forum. Our forum is highly engaging. We share resources, we share tools, we share insights, and we also share information about opportunities. Talking about opportunities, next week we are starting what I call a trilogy. In 3 weeks from now, COP27 is going to kick off in Egypt. So from next week, we begin our own countdown to COP27 with a 3-part event that are geared towards enabling you to be able to better report on climate change and environment issues. And first on the list next week, I'm going to be hosting the sustainability editor for Politico. The editor will be here to tell you and give you insights on how to pitch climate change and environment stories to editors to ensure that your pitches are not rejected. So come around with all the questions that you may have. And we're also going to have another part, and of course, our live from COP27 session is also going to be happening, insights from COP27. So please join us on this journey for COP27. If you also want to access more resources to improve your journalism reporting skills, please check out the International Journalist Network website on www.ignet.org. On behalf of myself and my boss in Nigeria, we call this my guy at the top, Stella. I said, thank you very much for everybody. Thank you for my panelists, and enjoy the rest of the day. And quick shout out to some panelists, some attendees that are joining us for the first time because of the time zone. I know this time works really, really perfectly well for some parts of the world. It worked really well, and hopefully we'll be able to host some. It's late night, as you can see over here, but for you, anywhere in the part of the world that you have, that's still day. I think this was specially done for you, and I hope you enjoyed and appreciated it. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. So we are out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stella, cut.